July 4th, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The air thick with summer heat and smoke. 40 German women, prisoners of war, stood frozen at the edge of a picnic area, their faces pale with terror. They had been taught one truth their entire lives. Americans are savages who torture their enemies. They expected starvation, beatings, death. Instead, they smelled barbecue, long tables covered in checkered cloth, pulled pork, cornbread, baked beans, the same food American soldiers were eating. When Greta Hoffman took her first bite, she didn't break down from poison. She broke down from kindness. Because in that moment, every lie she'd ever believed shattered. The enemy wasn't supposed to feed you like family. But if you want to hear how a simple barbecue changed everything these women thought they knew about mercy, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how these untold stories reach across the world. June 1945. The Atlantic Ocean stretched gray and endless, beneath a sky that refused to commit to either storm or calm. Greta Hoffman stood at the ship's rail, with her hands gripped tight on the cold metal, her knuckles white against the rust-flecked paint. Around her, 40 other German women clustered in small groups, their voices low and urgent, trading rumors like currency in a market where truth had long since fled. They had been Wehrmacht auxiliaries, radio operators and factory workers, and field nurses, caught in the chaos as the Reich collapsed around them, like a building whose foundation had rotted through. Now they were prisoners of war, packed onto an American transport ship, sailing toward a destination none of them could quite imagine. The ship rose and fell with the swells, and Greta's stomach rose and fell with it, though she could not tell any more which sickness came from the sea and which from fear. The women whispered what they had been told, what they had always known, what every poster and broadcast an officer had drilled into them, until it became more real than their own thoughts. Americans torture prisoners. They do not follow the Geneva rules. They are savages who will tear you apart for sport. Better to die than to fall into their hands. Greta had heard these things so many times. They had become like breathing, automatic and unquestioned. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, its edges soft from handling. Her husband stared back at her from the creased paper, his face serious under his field cap, his eyes looking just past the camera as if he could see something the photographer could not. The photo had been taken in 1942, before Stalingrad, before the letters stopped coming, before the official notice arrived with its cold, bureaucratic language about sacrifice and honor and the fatherland. His final letter lived in her memory more clearly than his face. Hold the faith, he had written in his careful script. Never surrender to them. Trust nothing they say. Remember what we are fighting for. She had read those words so many times the paper had nearly torn along the folds. She had believed every line because believing was easier than doubting, and doubt was a luxury they could not afford when the world was ending around them. But she had already betrayed him once. During the capture, when Soviet and American forces converged and the German lines dissolved into chaos, an officer had pressed something into her hand. A cyanide capsule, smooth and small, wrapped in wax paper. For when they catch you, he had said, better that than what they will do. She had clutched it for 3 days, feeling its weight in her pocket like a stone, like a promise, like the only choice she had left. Then one morning, alone in a commandeered barn while guards argued outside about transport schedules, she had unwrapped the capsule and looked at it sitting in her palm. Small, simple, final. And she had thought about her husband's words, about faith and honor, and never surrendering. She had thought about all of it. And then, she had dropped the capsule into a gap between the floorboards and listened to it rattle away into darkness. She had survived. That was her first betrayal. Now she faced the second, surviving in enemy hands. living when everything she had been taught said she should choose death instead. The shame of it sat in her chest like something heavy and cold. But beneath the shame was something else, something she barely dared to name: relief. The terrible, guilty relief of still being alive. The ship's engines thrummed beneath her feet, steady and relentless, carrying them west across an ocean that had swallowed so many before them. The other women continued their whispered conferences, comparing stories they had heard, warnings they had been given, rumors that had taken on the weight of fact through repetition. One woman swore she had heard about camps where prisoners were worked to death in mines. Another insisted they shaved your head and branded you. A third said simply that no one came back, which was its own kind of answer. Greta said nothing. She had learned in the radio service that silence was safer than speech, that listening told you more than talking ever could. She had spent years monitoring frequencies, tracking Allied transmissions, learning to hear what was not said in the gaps between words. Now, she listened to her fellow prisoners and heard beneath their certainty the same thing she felt in herself: fear, pure and simple and overwhelming, fear of what waited for them on the other side of this crossing. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, painting the water gold and silver, then disappeared again behind gray. Greta put the photograph back in her pocket and felt the shape of it against her hip, a small square of the past pressed against her present. She did not know what Texas looked like, could not imagine heat and dust after years of European mud and cold. She did not know what Americans would do to them, despite all the warnings and certainties and propaganda. She knew only that she had thrown away the capsule, that she had chosen to keep breathing, and that this choice would carry consequences she could not yet see. The ship cut through the waves, and the women stood at the rail, and the ocean stretched endlessly ahead. And somewhere beyond the horizon waited a truth that would crack their world open all over again. The Texas heat hit them like a physical thing when they stepped off the transport trucks, thick and pressing and utterly unlike anything Greta had known in Europe. Camp Swift sprawled before them in the July afternoon, all wooden barracks and barbed wire and dust that seemed to coat everything within minutes. The fence posts stood straight and new, the wire gleamed silver in the brutal sun, and American guards walked the perimeter with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Everything looked temporary, improvised, as if the whole camp had been thrown together quickly and might disappear just as fast. Greta had expected worse. She had steeled herself for something out of the whispered warnings, the propaganda images that had filled her mind for years: shaved heads, starvation rations, forced labor in mines or fields until you dropped. The systematic cruelty that every broadcast had promised waited in enemy hands. Instead, they were led to a processing station where an American sergeant checked names off a list with bureaucratic precision, his face bored rather than cruel. They kept their clothes. That was the first shock. Greta had been certain they would be stripped, issued prison uniforms, marked as less than human. But the sergeant simply waved them through, and they walked to their assigned barracks, still wearing the same threadbare dresses and patched coats they had traveled in. They kept their hair. A young private handed out bars of soap, actual soap that smelled clean and chemical, along with toothbrushes still wrapped in paper, and blankets that looked thin but new. The barracks were rough wood and screen windows, dusty and hot and crowded, but organized. Bunks lined the walls in neat rows. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. It was sparse and military and nothing like home. But it was not the pit of horror they had been promised. Greta set her small bag on a lower bunk and sat down slowly, feeling the thin mattress compress beneath her. Around her, the other women moved in stunned silence, touching the blankets, examining the soap, looking at each other with confusion written plain on their faces. A woman appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, Greta thought she was another prisoner. She wore civilian clothes, a simple skirt and blouse. her dark hair pinned back neatly. Then she spoke in German, fluent and unaccented, and Greta realized this was something else entirely. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Schmidt, translator and liaison officer. She explained the Geneva Convention rules in a calm, measured voice. Regular meals, medical care, letters home, censored but permitted, work assignments that were reasonable and limited, recreation time, no torture, no starvation, no brutality. Greta listened and thought it must be a trick. Kindness before the blow falls. Make them trust you, then show them what you really are. That was how interrogation worked, how manipulation worked, how every cruel system worked underneath its surface promises. She had seen enough of the Reich's own methods to recognize the pattern. Tell them one thing, do another. The gap between words and reality was where control lived. But the day passed, and the blow did not fall. Evening came, the heat easing slightly, as shadows stretched long across the compound. The women were led to the mess hall, and Greta went because there was no choice, because refusing meant standing out, and standing out was always dangerous. They walked in a tight cluster, 40 women who had become a single nervous organism, and as they approached the building, Greta smelled smoke. She stopped so suddenly, the woman behind her nearly collided with her back. Smoke. Rising in thick gray columns from somewhere behind the mess hall. Crematorium, her mind said immediately. Mass punishment. The final answer to what Americans really did with prisoners. Her throat closed, and her hands went cold, and she thought about the capsule she had thrown away, about how she had chosen wrong after all. Then they rounded the corner and saw it. Long tables set up outside in rows. American flags hanging limp in the still air. Checkered cloths spread over the tables, red and white squares like some kind of bizarre decoration, and the smoke rising not from ovens, but from massive pits, where meat turned slowly over coals, tended by American soldiers in aprons who looked more like cooks at a festival than guards at a prison camp. Sergeant Cooper stood near the tables, a tall man with gray at his temples and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but remembered how to be fair. Eleanor Schmidt translated as he spoke. Tomorrow is the 4th of July, Independence Day. It is our tradition to share it with everyone in camp. You are invited. Invited. The word made no sense. Invited to what? Invited how? It felt like mockery, like the cruelest joke, like the moment before everything good is ripped away to show the rot underneath. Some of the women whispered that it must be a final meal. The condemned fed well before execution. Others said nothing at all, their faces blank with incomprehension. Greta stared at the tables and the flags and the smoking pits, and felt something crack inside her certainty. Not break, not yet. Just crack. A hairline fracture in the wall of everything she had been taught. Americans do not do mercy. The Führer said so. Every broadcast said so. Every officer and every poster and every lesson had said so. They are beasts. They are savages. They will destroy you. But beasts did not set tables with checkered cloths. Savages did not invite their prisoners to holiday celebrations. And as Greta stood in the Texas heat, watching smoke rise into the darkening sky, she felt the crack widen just slightly, letting in a thin blade of light that hurt more than darkness ever had. The 4th of July arrived with heat that shimmered off the dusty ground, invisible waves. Greta woke before dawn. Her stomach twisted into knots, and lay on her bunk listening to the other women breathe in their sleep. Some had talked through the night about refusing to eat, about how the food must be poisoned, about how this was the trap they had been waiting for. Others had said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. When they were led to the picnic area that afternoon, Greta forced herself to watch the Americans first. Soldiers in olive drab uniforms stood in lines at the serving tables, laughing and talking, piling their plates high with meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. They ate with the casual enthusiasm of men who trusted completely what was in front of them. No hesitation, no fear. They served themselves the same food that sat steaming on the prisoners' tables. Eleanor Schmidt moved through the crowd with plates, her face carefully neutral, setting them in front of women who stared at the food like it might bite back. When she reached Greta, she placed a plate down gently, precisely, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was something in Eleanor's expression that Greta could not quite read. Not pity, not triumph. Something closer to exhaustion, or perhaps recognition. The plate held pulled pork that gleamed with sauce, coleslaw bright with vinegar, cornbread golden at the edges, baked beans dark with molasses. The smell rose up and hit Greta like a memory she did not know she had. Rich, smoky, real. She had not eaten actual meat in 2 years. The Wehrmacht rations had been ersatz, everything by the end. Sawdust bread and coffee made from acorns and soup, so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through it. She picked up the fork. Her hand shook slightly. Around her, other women sat frozen, staring at their plates, or at the Americans, or at nothing at all. One woman pushed her plate away. Another whispered a prayer Greta could not quite hear. Greta looked at the pork and thought about poison and propaganda and every warning that had brought them to this moment. Then she thought about the Americans eating the same food, the same exact food, from the same pots. She took one bite. The taste exploded across her tongue, salt and smoke and sweetness all at once, and for a moment, her entire body focused on that single sensation. Food. Real food. The kind that sustained rather than merely kept you alive. Her throat tightened, and her eyes burned, and she realized with horror that she was about to cry. Not from poison, from kindness. From the sudden, overwhelming realization that everything she had been taught was a lie. Every broadcast, every order, every certainty that had held her together through the war's collapse. The savage Americans were feeding them the same food they fed their own soldiers. Better food than Germany had given its people in years. And they were doing it on their Independence Day, their most sacred holiday, as if sharing this meal with enemies was the most natural thing in the world. The breakdown started somewhere behind Greta, a soft sound that might have been a cough or might have been a sob. Then another woman started crying, quietly at first and then with shaking shoulders that she could not control. The sound spread like a crack in ice. One woman after another letting go of something they had been holding too tightly for too long. Some wept quietly into their hands. Others shook with silent sobs. One woman simply stared at her plate and let tears run down her face unchecked. Greta felt her own face crumple, felt something inside her chest come apart like wet paper. She had believed. She had truly believed. She had served with pride, had felt righteous anger against enemies who deserved destruction, had mourned her husband as a hero who died fighting savages. And all of it, every single piece, had been built on lies so big she could not see around their edges. A woman near her whispered, barely audible. "They told us Americans would tear us apart." Eleanor Schmidt stood nearby, and Sergeant Cooper said something to her in English. She translated, her voice steady, but not unkind. "We follow Geneva rules. Always." The words hung in the hot Texas air like a promise, or perhaps a condemnation. Greta looked down at the photograph in her pocket, the edges visible above the fabric. Her husband staring forever at something just past the camera. He had died at Stalingrad, believing they were fighting for something true, something worth dying for. He had told her to hold the faith, to never surrender to the enemy, to remember what they were fighting for. But what had they been fighting for? What had he died for? Not truth, not honor, not even Germany, really, but a lie so big it had eaten a generation whole. The rage came sudden and fierce, not at the Americans with their checkered tablecloths and their smiling guards, but at the men who had sent her husband to freeze and starve and die in a Russian winter for nothing. At the officers who had lied with such confidence that belief became easier than doubt. At herself for not questioning, for not seeing, for choosing faith over thought because thought was dangerous and faith was safe. She picked up her fork again and took another bite, then another. The act felt like rebellion, like choosing reality over everything she had been taught reality should be. Around her, other women began to eat, slowly at first, and then with the desperate hunger of people who had been starving in more ways than one. The food was good, impossibly, unforgivably good, and with every bite, Greta felt the propaganda burning away, leaving behind something raw and painful, but at least, finally, true. The weeks that followed the 4th of July settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, which was perhaps the strangest thing of all. Morning roll call in the compound, the women standing in loose rows, while an American sergeant checked names off his clipboard with the same bored efficiency he might bring to counting supplies. Work assignments that were light by any measure Greta had known. Laundry duty or garden work or kitchen help, nothing that broke bodies or crushed spirits. Letters home, each one read by censors but still permitted, still possible, thin threads connecting them to whatever remained of the world they had left behind. Greta volunteered for kitchen duty. She told herself it was practical, that working near food meant staying close to the symbol of her awakening. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She needed to be near the kitchens, the way a person needs to touch something real to prove they are not dreaming. The Americans kept feeding them. Every day, real food, the same food the guards ate. And every day the propaganda in her head grew quieter, replaced by something more painful: reality. She watched Sergeant Cooper enforce the rules with a fairness that seemed almost mechanical in its consistency. When a young guard made a crude joke about one of the prisoners within earshot, Cooper called him out publicly, his voice flat and hard. The guard apologized to the woman directly, his face red with shame. When another guard was caught taking extra cigarettes from the supply room, Cooper had him reassigned within hours. No favoritism, no exceptions. The rules applied to everyone, or they applied to no one, and Cooper seemed to believe this with the kind of conviction that made others believe it too. Greta began talking to Eleanor Schmidt during the kitchen shifts, careful questions at first, testing the ice before walking on it. Why treat us like this? Why follow rules when you do not have to? Why feed your enemies the same food you feed yourselves? Eleanor's answers came slowly, thoughtfully, as if she was weighing each word before releasing it. Because rules matter. Because you are people. Because if we become monsters to fight monsters, we have already lost. The words sat strangely in Greta's mind. She had been taught that war was about strength, about domination, about proving your side was right by crushing the other side completely. Mercy was weakness. Restraint was failure. But here was Eleanor saying the opposite, saying it quietly and meaning it completely. And Greta did not know what to do with that, except carry it around like a stone she could not set down. Eleanor shared her own pain one afternoon when they were alone in the storage room, counting bags of flour. Her parents had disappeared from Hamburg in 1943. No word since, no confirmation, just gone into the machinery of the Reich and never emerged. Eleanor's voice stayed steady as she said it, but her hands shook slightly as she marked numbers on her clipboard. Greta looked at her and realized with a force that made her chest tight that they had both lost. Different sides, same grief. The war had taken from everyone, and the propaganda had insisted only one side deserved to mourn. August brought a package from the Red Cross, and Greta watched as Cooper authorized a small party for the prisoners. Real coffee, the kind that smelled like memory. Chocolate in thin squares wrapped in brown paper. Writing paper in envelopes. Precious and simple and impossibly normal. The women gathered in the barracks that evening, and for the first time in years, Greta heard laughter. Not bitter laughter. Not the laughter of people who had forgotten how to cry. Just laughter. Simple and human and alive. She helped teach some of the American Guards basic German phrases, small things like good morning and thank you and how are you. Private James Holland, barely 22 with a farm boy's earnest face, admitted his grandmother had come from Bavaria. He stumbled over the pronunciation and grinned when he got it wrong, and Greta found herself smiling back without thinking about it. The propaganda had never mentioned that enemies could have grandmothers from the same villages. That detail had been inconvenient to the story they needed to tell. One evening, someone found a harmonica, and an old woman whose name Greta had never learned began to play. The melody rose, clear and mournful in the Texas heat, a German folk song that Greta knew from childhood. Die Gedanken sind frei. Thoughts are free. The irony was so sharp it nearly drew blood. She had spent years with her thoughts imprisoned, locked inside propaganda so thick she could not see daylight. Now, in a prisoner of war camp surrounded by barbed wire and guards with rifles, her thoughts were freer than they had ever been. The American Guards stopped their patrols to listen. They did not understand the words, but they understood the music, the universal language of longing and loss, and the hope that maybe, somehow, home still existed somewhere beyond the wire. For 1 hour the war felt distant, not forgotten, but set aside, like a burden they could put down just long enough to catch their breath. Greta looked around at the women sitting on their bunks, at the guards standing respectfully at the door, at Eleanor translating softly for Sergeant Cooper, who nodded as if he understood more than just the words. She thought about going home, about Germany in ruins, about whether forgiveness was even possible for people who had believed what she had believed. Maybe we can go home, she thought. Maybe we can be forgiven. Maybe mercy is not just something they give us, but something we learn to give ourselves. The harmonica played on, and for a moment Greta let herself believe it. Late August 1945. The war was over, truly over, not just collapsing but finished, signed and sealed, and impossible to deny anymore. News from Europe arrived in pieces, fragments of information that built a picture none of them wanted to see. Cities bombed flat, millions displaced, starvation spreading across the continent like a slow poison. Germany carved up between victors who would decide its future without asking what Germans wanted. The world they had known was gone, and what was rising in its place looked nothing like the Reich's promises of thousand-year glory. Sergeant Cooper announced one morning that they would be shown a newsreel. Required viewing. All prisoners in the mess hall at 1400 hours. No exceptions. The women filed in quietly, their brief moment of peace already evaporating under the weight of something they could feel coming, but could not yet name. The projector sat on a table at the back of the room, its mechanical eye waiting. Guards lined the walls, their faces carefully neutral. Eleanor Schmidt stood near the front, and Greta noticed her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. The lights went down. The projector clicked to life. And they watched. Not propaganda, not exaggeration, not allied lies meant to justify their victory. Real footage. Actual film from places with names that meant nothing to Greta until the narrator spoke them with the gravity of damnation. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. The camera moved through camps that were not prisoner of war camps, not military detention facilities, but something else entirely. Something that had no name in any language Greta knew, because human speech had not needed a word for it before. The skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. The mass graves bulldozed open, revealing layer upon layer of the dead. The survivors who looked like walking corpses, eyes, huge in faces, that were nothing but bone and skin stretched tight. The children. God help her, the children, their small bodies discarded like trash. their faces frozen in expressions that Greta would see every time she closed her eyes for the rest of her life. The narrator's voice cut through the silence, flat and damning. This is what the Reich built while telling you lies. This is what you fought for. This is what your uniforms protected. The words landed like physical blows, each one precise, each one true, each one unbearable. Greta made it halfway through before she staggered to her feet and pushed past the other women, past the guards who did not stop her, out into the Texas heat that felt clean compared to the darkness inside. She fell to her knees behind the barracks and vomited until there was nothing left. And then she vomited again, her body trying to expel something that lived deeper than her stomach, something that had taken root in her soul. She had helped this. She had plotted coordinates for fighter planes. She had tracked Allied movements. She had been proud of her precision, her efficiency, her service to the fatherland. And all of it, every single bit of her careful work, had supported the machinery that built those camps. She had believed she was defending Germany. She had been defending hell. Inside the mess hall, the newsreel continued. Greta could hear it through the walls, the narrator's voice explaining the systematic nature of it, the industrial efficiency, the way an entire nation had been organized around extermination while people like her went about their duties and told themselves they were serving something noble. Some of the women were claiming they did not know. Others had gone silent with a kind of shock that looked like death itself. A few still insisted it must be propaganda, Allied manipulation, lies designed to break them. Greta could not speak. She stopped eating, though the Americans still brought food. She stopped sleeping, though her body begged for rest. The BBQ, the kindness, the mercy, all of it felt like condemnation now. Why did they treat us well? We do not deserve it. We deserve nothing. We deserve worse than nothing. The camp mood turned dark. Women moved like shadows, hollow-eyed and mechanical. Conversations died mid-sentence. The laughter from the harmonica evening felt like something from another lifetime, another world where such things were still possible. Greta worked her kitchen shifts in silence, her hands performing tasks, while her mind circled the same thoughts over and over like a bird trapped in a room, battering itself against windows that would not open. Eleanor learned through official channels that her parents were dead. Not missing. Not disappeared. Dead. Verified. Their names appeared on a list from Bergen-Belsen, typed in neat rows with dates and numbers that reduced human beings to administrative records. She had to translate that list as part of her duties, had to read her own parents' names aloud while Sergeant Cooper marked them on his master documents. And Greta watched her face stay perfectly still until the work was done. That night, Eleanor came to the barracks and broke down, not in her office or her quarters, but among the women whose country had killed her parents. And Greta sat beside her, because there was nothing else to do. No words that would help, no comfort that was not obscene in its inadequacy. They sat together in silence, two women who had lost everything to the same machine. And finally Greta spoke. "You should hate us. You should hate me." "I would." Eleanor's voice came rough with tears. "I did. For years. But hate did not bring them back. Hate just made me more alone. And if I let it, hate would turn me into exactly what I am fighting against." The words settled between them like stones, heavy and permanent, and Greta did not know what to do with them except carry them alongside everything else that would not let her go.